Hey, so someone recently got me thinking about a potential link between being an HSP and having avoidant personality disorder. So I decided to read a little bit more about that and do a video and see what you guys thought. So if you're not familiar with the acronym, HSP refers to a highly sensitive person, and it's a term coined by the psychologist Elaine Aron in the 90s. And it refers to a person that has particularly high sensory processing sensitivity. And I'll explain more about what that means in a second. But it's estimated that about 15 to 20% of the population are HSPs, so it's more like a personality trait rather than a disorder. And studies would suggest that it's innate and based on genetics, and it's found in many species other than humans as well. It's probably closer to a binary, like being right or left-handed, rather than a dimension or spectrum like height. And fMRIs have discerned it as having actual differences in brain function in a handful of studies, so it would seem that it's a real thing. And it can be simply explained to be made of four main interrelated parts. So there's increased depth of processing, which basically means considering individual things more deeply. There's being easily overstimulated, which is basically as a consequence of considering each individual thing more deeply. It doesn't take as many things to overwhelm you. Having strong emotional reactions to things, stronger than other people would have, and being sensitive to subtleties, so small details and environments and things like that. So there's a simple test you can take about HSP behaviors, which is just yes or no questions that I'll link in the description if you're interested. And what I found interesting as far as a potential link between HSPs and AvPD are that some of the traits and behaviors associated with HSPs are basically part of AvPD. You can probably gather that from how I described the four parts above. We tend to overanalyze a lot of things and be easily overstimulated and have strong emotional reactions and notice subtle details. So that's not really surprising. But if you take the test, there are also more specific behavioral examples in the test, like needing to withdraw when a lot is going on, trying hard to avoid making mistakes ever, avoiding certain types of situations that you're bound to be uncomfortable in, and having an inability to function while being observed. So a lot of the things that HSPs would display are also things that people with AVPD would display. However, there are also quite a few things that are seemingly completely unrelated. And what's interesting is that I found I exhibited pretty much all of these traits, including the unrelated ones, to a variable but pretty significant degree. And that would make sense if it's true, as studies suggest, that different aspects of sensory processing sensitivity are largely tied together and based on genetics. But it's really interesting because I wasn't aware of that before. So some of the unrelated traits that I exhibit are things like being overwhelmed by sensory input like loud noises, and of course that can be related to anxiety, but it's really not most of the time. It's even if something's completely predictable and it's a loud noise made by something that I know isn't a human being about to interact with me, it can still really drive me nuts. Being highly affected by other people's moods, which I don't know how common this is or isn't, but it certainly is the case for me. Being deeply moved by music and having a high sensitivity to things like pain and caffeine and violence. Um, and an interesting side note, apparently HSPs who are men tend to answer few of these questions as being true than those who are women. But in my case, the only question that I didn't answer as being true was having mood and concentration disruption when I'm very hungry. Everything else on that test has been true of me pretty much forever, not just since I started dealing with severe anxiety and AVPD. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to read on Elaine Aron's website, which is the one that the test is on, that I don't have time to talk about in this one video, but I want to read one quote about research she conducted in 2005, which I thought was interesting as far as the relation between HSPs and AVPD. Adult HSPs who have had difficulties in childhood, especially their bond with their parents, are more likely to be depressed, anxious, or shy than non-HSPs. But HSPs with normal, good enough childhoods had no more of these problems in adulthood as non-HSPs. In the experiment, we found that HSPs in general reacted more emotionally to good and bad feedback, while non-HSPs hardly responded at all. So I thought that was really interesting, and it sort of opens a question for me, which is, do praise and criticism barely affect most of the population in an emotional or long-term way? Because if it's true that 80% of the population are non-HSPs by these standards, and if this study is accurate, that basically non-HSPs tend to not really react to these things, except in very mild ways, it would seem to explain why people that don't have AVPD have a hard time understanding it, because it may be the case that people with AVPD are generally HSPs already, and so their brains react in a very specific, good or bad way to praise or criticism, and non-HSPs may not react to these things at all. So people who are non-HSPs and also don't have AvPD might have a very hard time understanding why AvPD develops and why we care so much about judgment and criticism. Because of that reason, it just does not affect their brains in the same way. So I'm curious, of course, whether it's the case that everyone that has AvPD or everyone that develops AvPD already had high sensory processing sensitivity, even in the ways that don't seem related to AvPD beforehand. So I'm curious about you guys that have AvPD or think you do, whether you also have high sensory processing sensitivity based on the questions in this test and similar stuff, and whether you think that applied before you started dealing with AvPD stuff, because it did for me. You know, I've dealt with that sort of stuff forever before my anxiety started getting particularly bad. And it, you know, it might sort of explain why we can develop these very bad responses to criticism that other people just can't necessarily even understand. Yeah, I've read about HSPs before and noticed that it was probably a thing that applied to me, but I didn't really relate it to my AvPD in any important way. But it seems like an interesting possibility, so I'm curious what you guys think about that. And thanks to the person that mentioned this to me, because it's very interesting. So anyway, thanks guys, and I'll see you next time.